Yeah, thanks again. So it's really a great honor for me today to talk to you about the many contributions by Jens Lenich to advance physical design over more than 3 decades and across many different domains. First, also, I'd like to thank the ISBD committee for inviting me on this wonderful occasion. And second, I would also like to thank the colleagues from TU Dresden for their great contributions to this talk, as well as to the attached survey paper. Now, we've already heard from the previous very excellent talks from Professor Scheible and Professor Kang that there's apparently a core philosophy for all the works by Professor Lenich, which is basically that we have to consider robustness and reliability as an overarching objectives, going beyond the traditional PPA. So in that sense, Lenich's work bridges quite well the gap between the established design practices, which of course he also employs to manage complexity and scalability. But again, he bridges the gap with the physical reality for physical design. Now, in the interest of time, what I'd like to do in this talk is basically give you an overview of the different contributions across the different domains. And again, I have to just be on the high level and provide selected examples. I will be skipping the, let's say, the earlier works from EA, which had been very excellently already explained by Professor Kang. And so the first topic I would like to cover would be that of analog design automation. So we already know and we have heard that analog design was and is more complex and more difficult than digital design. And there are many reasons for this. And one of them is, of course, the management of the different complex constraints. And as outlined here, also over a timeline, is basically that Jens and colleagues proposed really a paradigm shift going from the schematic-driven layout toward the constraint-driven design. So to understand a little bit better what this means, this constraint-driven design, so the idea is here to formally define, propagate, and verify different constraints to make sure that the related requirements are met throughout the whole design flow and across the whole design. Indicated now to the left is that basically we have different constraints across hierarchies, connectivity, as well as geometry. And so each and every related cell has to basically, again, be exposed to those constraints, and they have to be verified and met across these hierarchies in different levels. Professor Lenich and colleagues proposed different solutions towards this end, and shown to the right is kind of a generic system, if you will, which is called constraint engineering system. This integrates different functional tools with means for, again, formulating constraints and also solving those constraints. Now, in addition to these, all of these relevant efforts and contributions, which also found their way to industry, there's also another remarkable approach or philosophy, if you will, which we found in Professor Lenich's group, namely that of enabling the community at large also with open source design tools. And an example shown here for open source constraint-driven design is shown here with different GUIs, what we see for a tool called Beacon, which includes different GUIs for the visualization, for the management, and for the verification of different constraints. And this tool was also just recently released on GitHub. Another example for such open source contributions is shown now here. So the group had been working on something called the Open Design Rule format, which was used for different tasks like automatic generation and verification of DRC run sets. And more recently, there's also an effort called Open Orchestrator, which is basically used to connect different tools like Xscheme and K-Layout, and enables the user basically to propagate different entities and different components between those tools and really interconnect those different tools. Now moving on to the second domain or topic of interest, that of EM-aware physical design. We've already heard that this work or these efforts began with his experience in industry, and they still continue to be a primary research focus for the Institute and the group up until today. Different topics and different problems have been tackled, which are listed here, and which I also like to show in an overview slide. Next. So the initial efforts were really focused on the current density simulation, the corresponding optimization of the interconnects, and as indicated, this was done in very close collaboration with industry. Then around 2017, there was the shift to the physics-based models, which basically enable to have a more accurate assessment of the interconnects for their risk for EM failure. And based on these insights and efforts, then a range of other directions did evolve, so which are shown here now. We have the EM robust routing, we have something called the designer-friendly verification, and there are also means for technology characterization. And again, all of them are also connected and supported by industry efforts. If we look a little bit closer into this, so shown here is now the high-level idea for EM robustness in the design flow. This can be done in different stages and in different approaches, which are also complementary. So on the one hand, we want to avoid EM risks, but on the other hand, also if needed, we want to repair. And this could be done, for example, in routing as a proactive measure in terms of mitigating. So shown here is a simplified version of this flow. That means after global routing, there would be an estimation of the stress for all the possible nets. Then nets would be ordered such that sensitive or critical nets, which would be prone to early failure, are prioritized in the routing. So as long as still sufficient resources are available. And then later on, after we conduct also the detailed routing, there would be a re-evaluation of the stress profile. And basically, if needed, also repair runs would be conducted. So the other aspect we also have to look at is then verification and also repairs. So here for verification and repairs, looking at fixing violations or first finding them, there's the requirement that we also have to understand the correct parameters for those models, right? So, and this comes back then to the technology characterization and also again the collaborations with industry in this context. And also mentioned is this designer-friendly approach for modeling. So instead of having designers to use FEM simulations, the idea could be using those RC networks shown here, which can equally well describe and help to characterize also EM-relevant structures like reservoirs. And again, this is kind of something which is really also pushing the industry forward to still further consider those problems. Moving on to the third domain of interest is that of system-level design. So the moment then industry started to look into more and more, also Professor Linich fostered some research and development for automation in this domain with different examples listed here. And we look into them now briefly as well. So the first one is pin assignment. Here the challenge is to simultaneously consider and optimize interfaces across hierarchy levels, as shown here, for different ICs and then the package. The group has developed different optimization algorithms in this context, and they also considered practical relevant aspects, like, for example, differential pairs for signal integrity. And all of these efforts have then also been implemented in commercial design flows with IBM, and there were also consideration of other aspects like routing prediction. Routing prediction, if we look at this, so these are basically some probabilistic models which are flexible, as in they can consider different shapes, different patterns, also blockages, and they're also adaptive and additive in nature. So shown to the left is basically the additive nature that we consider such a estimation for multiple nets. And then shown to the right is also that eventually, if we do this for the full chip analysis for an ISPD benchmark shown here, there are also built-in means for, let's say, considering of over-congested regions. So these are also quite important modeling efforts, and again, they have been also integrated in commercial design flows. Another topic in that context of system-level design would be data structures and floor planning now for 3D ICs. So there were some early systematic investigations in the group for existing data structures, and based on this, then there were also some developments for more advanced data structures, like a 3D moving block sequence as shown here. The interesting thing about this data structure is shown to the right, that it can natively support different shapes of modules in the 2D domain as well as in the 3D domain. And as also shown to the right, to the lower right corner, is that this data structure supported an efficient design space exploration using probabilistic floor planning algorithms. Now talking about floor planning, the group also looked now into multi-objective optimization for floor planning in the context of 3D design, considering thermal management, interconnect planning, and other features. And also the group looked into the interposer domain or the chiplets integration, where there were efforts for, again, efficient design space exploration, but now for the optimal placement of such chiplets. And talking about chiplets, there's also another interesting, more recent effort that is for stamp-based chiplet integration visualized here. So there's a technique used for this called microtransfer printing, where basically there's an elastomer stamp which transfers dyes from a source to a target wafer. And here the challenges are now that you have different new wafer level dependencies, constraints, and also impact on yield, depending on how we are printing those different chips onto the wafer. And with these different constraints in mind, the tool or the group also developed some graph-based modeling first and also optimization techniques, which are just illustrated here. And they also developed a tool with industry partners together called then also Wafer Planner. Now, aside from these remarkable contributions in more or less classical domains, there were also interesting contributions in other domains, for example, with thermal modeling and simulation, flexible printed circuits, and so on. And also here, I would just like to present a few examples. So the first one is what is called security closure. And here we are treating physical effects as potential attack surfaces. So as an example illustrated to the left could be that transistor aging impacts delays and then also side channels, which is not shown here, but more visually maybe approachable is then to the right, that we could have something called migration effects-based trojans in the interconnects. So we've already heard that the via configuration plays a role if we have upstream versus downstream. And now the thinking is here that an adversary could actually change from an upstream configuration into a downstream configuration and then make a sensitive interconnect more prone to early failure. And these kind of problems are quite interesting, and of course they can be natively approached as a reliability problem as well. And speaking about this EM Trojan, what I just mentioned, this can also be very interesting to bring into the context now of these modern advanced packages. Right, so shown to the left is now such a chiplet system. And if we could think of that such a Trojan would be basically integrated or lurking in the shadows of those microprograms when we have the traditional or established X-ray inspection, then this could be indeed an interesting and novel concern. And shown to the right are now some geometries of such Trojans and some examples how X-ray inspection in this context could be much more challenging. Of course, this idea about security closure is not only about assessing different threats, which again are based on reliability problems, but it's also about mitigation of such problems. And again, clearly there are synergies with reliability-aware design. And Linich and colleagues tackled this with different means, for example, migration-aware routing rules and algorithms, and this is also still efforts or collaborative efforts which are going on until today. Now moving on away maybe from the physical design more into the system design, and the example here is shown the flexible electronics. So also here the group had some contributions in the sense that they started with a classical design flow, using again also open source tools. They described in addition to the classical 2D domain then also the additional bands and angles as needed for such flexible electronics. And then eventually they were also able to transform those designs into 3D meshes, which are then ready for FEM simulation. Yet another example would be that of the planning for automotive wiring harnesses. If you're looking at this, a few challenges could be where to allocate controllers, what kind of components to assign to controllers. And what we can see is clearly that this maps also to EDA problems, right? So we can think of this as optimal routing problems, as partitioning problems, and also here the team developed tools for these means, and again also with industry collaboration. And in the bigger picture, there are also many more efforts, products, and projects at the Institute for System Design and Precision Engineering. Shown are here some few examples for LED system, medical devices, and so on. But again, there are many more efforts under the leadership by Professor Linich and also colleagues at the institutes. Last but not least, I would also like to touch upon the theme of education textbooks. In terms of education, we can say that Professor Linich basically reformed the curriculum at the Institute by integrating design automation with the established system design and precision engineering. And shown here is now the number of students over the years for selected courses. And we should note here that this basically ranges from the undergrad level to the advanced electives. With undergrad levels, there are hundreds of students typically, and for the electives, there are tens of students. So overall, there were literally thousands of students which Professor Linich and colleagues enabled over the years with both the theory as well as the practical experience for CAD PCB design and layout synthesis. And naturally, especially today, I'm also very proud to say that not too many years ago, I was one of those students as well. And we already heard about the books, but I would still like to highlight them again because they were really foundational textbooks and they really defined the modern curriculum. They had enabled students, but also practitioners with insights in different domains, and shown here are basically only the most essential books for the design community and also only the latest English versions on top. But I also still remember quite fondly from my time of my own studies when I was going through the first version, the first German version of the book shown in the middle here. And maybe as a final remark, a bit more on the humor side, if you will. So if we had to actually take all those books, put them in the bookshelf, and measure their literal extent, we would reach something like 23 centimeters shown here. And maybe what we can say is that especially for junior and growing educators, this could be maybe a new measure or metric to aspire to, in addition to the the classical established metrics like citations and grants and so on. So with this said, let me conclude now. While it's certainly difficult to give justice to all the many contributions by Professor Jens Linich, I would try to do this in those 4 points here. So first is really his continuous commitment to ground algorithms in the physical reality, underpinned with industrial collaborations which really enabled real-world advances. Second point is really that he pioneered paradigm shifts for reliable and robust design, in particular with this constraint-driven analog design and EM-aware design. Third is that he also has shown this foresight with the system-level complexities to tackle them also for robust design for both classical as well as emerging applications. And last but certainly not least, with his leadership, mentorship, and the comprehensive textbooks, where he has codified really the principles of robust design for the next generation of engineers. And with all this said, really many, many heartfelt congratulations to Professor Jens Linich for the ISPD 2026 Lifetime Achievement Award.